Well, dear Ben, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome, and I've been reading some of your interviews that you've given throughout the last couple of years, and in many of those you mention and you specifically point to one idea, notion that Ukraine is able to win the war. And I would like to start on this. Could you expand, first of all, in your mind, what victory is for Ukraine and where this idea is coming from?
Yeah. So we know from history that war is a test of will and a test of logistics. And I think the whole world has watched Ukrainian soldiers and people, the will that they have to win. They're defending their country. Um, there's not one Russian soldier that really wants to be there. They're sent there. So that's part of the reason I remain optimistic. And then when you look at the last 11 years, I mean, you have to keep reminding everybody that the war started 11 years ago, not 3 years ago. And after 11 years, with Russia having every advantage, they still control less than 20% of Ukraine. The Great Black Sea Fleet, which has a really cool name, is nowhere to be found. The Russian Air Force is, with all of its advantages, has failed its two main tasks of achieving air superiority or interdicting the lines of communication over which all the ammunition and equipment comes from Poland to Ukraine. Not one train or not one convoy have been destroyed. That's an incredible failure by the Russian Air Force. Um, so, this is not going to be about casualties. The Kremlin obviously does not care how many of their own soldiers are killed, uh, but it highlights the fact that Russia cannot defeat Ukraine. They cannot knock them out of the war. And I think Russia's economy is propped up artificially right now. And if we in the West got serious about this, about really trying to help Ukraine actually win, then we would shut down their ability to export oil and gas, no matter what the price, to India and China. So these are the factors that give me optimism. Now, obviously, where I was wrong over the past 3 years, I completely failed to appreciate that the Biden administration and many European countries would not do what was necessary to actually help Ukraine win. They were more concerned about that Russia might use a nuclear weapon. And so the failure to clearly define winning as a strategic objective is what resulted in all these really poor policies about what to provide, how fast, how slow, restrictions, etc. And the Trump administration, of course, has made it even worse by stopping intelligence as well as actual aid. But the last thing is, of course, your question, what does winning look like? And for me, winning has always been about what President Zelensky said. It's full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, that the borders of Ukraine are restored back to the 1991 boundaries. And that, of course, part of that would be include some sort of security guarantee, return of the thousands of kidnapped Ukrainian children, um, Russian war criminals held accountable, and then some sort of reconstruction, whatever. Um, but my test of will theory also includes at the political level, and here Putin has superior will to Western leaders, including the United States. So this is why we are where we are, in my view.
Ben, you touched upon a very interesting point about the fear of escalation that we've seen during the last almost all 3 years. That was kind of the linchpin of the strategy. In your mind, how do you explain where is it coming from?
Well, of course, even before Russia's large-scale invasion in February of 22, they were threatening, signaling that, hey, don't forget, we have lots of nuclear weapons. And, President Biden, who deserves credit for a lot of things, but, what he said before the Russians even launched the large-scale invasion, he said, no boots on the ground, because he didn't want to provoke. And I think the people around him, Jake Sullivan, but many others, not only them, really believe that Russia might use a nuclear weapon. And I think this comes from two or three things. First of all, there is a part of the DC, Washington D.C. Circles that still has this idea that Russia is the Soviet Union. It's this huge
Mm.
power, and and that we have to figure out how to deal with them somehow, and that they could be dealt with in a like they're a responsible state. So this naivety that has affected American strategic thinking for many years. Remember, George Bush said, "I looked into Putin's eyes and I saw his soul."
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Jesus. So there's that. And then of course President Biden is of a generation where he grew up immediately following the Second World War, and would have lived through all the Cold War, all the nuclear threats, the possibility of a nuclear war. And so it's understandable that as President of the United States, when you literally have the weight of the world on your shoulders, he, for him, the idea of Russia using a nuclear weapon was something to be avoided at all costs. Nobody wants a nuclear war. The problem is because, I mean, the Russians could see that. And that's why about once every 2 weeks, Medvedev or somebody would come out there and talk about we're doing a nuclear exercise in Belarus, or we're testing this new thing, or we're redoing our doctrine. They weren't doing anything except refreshing everybody's memory that they have a lot of nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, Germany in particular, but some other European countries also thought, "Phew, we can't give tourists because the Russians might use a nuclear weapon." And when you think about it, Russia was never going to use a nuclear weapon. There was no place to use it. There was zero benefit for Russia to ever use a tactical nuclear weapon, or any other type.
Mhm.
The value for them was the threat because they saw how we reacted.
Mm. Do you think that Ukrainians, would you be able to say that Ukrainians changed the way they wage war since 2022? I mean, of course, since 2014, but I mean, since the full-scale invasion and now, how do you assess the change in their, thinking and military strategy?
You talking about the Ukrainians?
Ukrainians, yeah.
Yeah. So I've always thought that the best organizations were learning organizations that could adapt, that could see what was happening, and make necessary changes in doctrine or structures and organization, incorporate new weapons, etc. Um, I think I was in Kiev just 2 weeks, maybe 10 days before the large scale invasion. I was there with a small delegation to help convey to the Ukrainian government. It's like, hey, they are coming. The Russians are absolutely coming. And it was clear that Ukraine was not prepared. I mean, you could walk around Kiev. I mean, it felt a little different, but that was not a city that looked like they were anticipating a Russian attack in the next few days. Um, so fortunately, a combination of individual acts of courage, some preparations at the last minute, particularly on air defense systems, some incompetence by the Russians, and a little bit of luck, Ukraine was able to stop them. And then of course, you know what happened next as well as anybody. Um, where the Ukrainians have evolved and improved so dramatically is in their ability to develop long-range precision strike capability on their own,
Mhm.
on top of what the West has provided. I mean, this is how you defeat Russia's advantage of mass, is with precision by taking out headquarters, logistics, airfields, and increasingly oil and gas infrastructure. So I think this is one area. The second area is the resilience of Ukraine's infrastructure. I mean, the Russians are pounding the hell out of Ukrainian cities. I mean, it's awful. But yet, despite that, Ukraine has increased its own defense industry over the course of the war, which it goes to a certain sort of resilience and creativity of how can you do things in a way, even though Russia is constantly going after your power grid.
Mhm.
That impresses me. Their rail system. I mean, I've heard many people talk about how effective the rail system is, despite attacks on the rail infrastructure. Yet the Ukrainians seem to be able to repair it very quickly or work around it and still deliver things. So there's a resilience there that really impresses me. And the last thing I would say, of course, uh, Ukraine and Russia together are both so far ahead of the rest of us in terms of electronic warfare. I mean, this is a lost competency for the U.S. Army. After the Cold War, we didn't do it. We didn't need it in
Hmm.
Iraq or Afghanistan, not really. And now we're scrambling to try and regain that competency. But the
Hmm.
Ukrainians, I mean, they're at the head of the class on how to operate in this heavily contested electronic warfare environment. And of course, the Russians are right behind them.
Yeah, I mean, I am always surprised when the notion, at least in in some of the countries that I visit or in my own country, when we have this thinking that we're still going to Ukraine to teach them something. I'm always suggesting that I think that there's a lot that we need to learn from them
Yeah.
because as you say, because the Russians do have very similar capabilities right now as Ukrainians, and we unfortunately we do lack them. But with this, my question would be, you and I both are advocating for additional Western support to Ukraine, but at this stage, do we still have the abilities? I mean, abilities or capabilities that we could share with Ukrainians? And if yes, what that could be at this
I
stage of
think,
war?
yeah, I think the things that the Ukrainians need that they cannot produce in numbers yet are ammunition, obviously. So, as your former chief of defense there in Lithuania told me last year, he said, Ben, the Ukrainians lost Avdiivka not because they didn't have enough drones, but because they didn't have enough artillery ammunition. So,
Hmm.
drones don't replace artillery ammunition. It's an additional capability. And so I think continuing to deliver ammunition to meet the requirements of Ukrainian armed forces is something that we still have to do that the Ukrainians cannot do for themselves. Their innovation and their technical skill. Of course, you know that Ukraine was the heart of the Soviet Union's defense industry for all those decades. And with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine still has this residual technical and engineering expertise and sort of culture. And fortunately, that has paid off for them in this war. But they're not yet able to meet to scale that to
Hmm.
produce the number. So this is an area where I think we can help. Um, the
Ben, just a follow-up question on this. Do you think it's possible for Ukrainians to start producing ammunition themselves,
Sure.
or are there restrictions that wouldn't allow them to do that?
Well, they would face the same challenges that we all do on finding all the necessary ingredients, if you will, for the explosive. But I don't. I mean, the Russians, of course, would come after something like an ammunition plant, but um, I think that the Ukrainians probably are. I'm certain. I mean, we know that they make anti-ship missiles. They make Neptune. They've made some other things. So they know how to do this. Um, I can't think of a restriction except for
Mm-hmm.
scale. Um, the weapons like Taurus, of course, there is no magic weapon, but when you have the ability to hit a critical headquarters or a logistics site, rail infrastructure, or oil and gas infrastructure at distance, I mean that makes a difference. That would be significant. This is something I wish that I hope that Chancellor Merz, when he becomes Chancellor here in a couple of weeks, I hope he will do that. Um, and then finally, I think the your point earlier is exactly right. We should be sending all kinds of people there to take notes, to study what they are doing. I was really annoyed a year and a half ago when people were tisk-tisking that Ukraine didn't attack the way that we thought they should have when they launched their offense. We would never send an American or Lithuanian or German soldier on an attack like that without having already completely dominated the skies overhead. We'd never do that. And yet we were, wagging our finger at the Ukrainians. I was embarrassing.
Yeah. I have a question about logistics. Just a couple of days ago, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, he said that the 7 units of Patriot launchers that have been promised a year ago have been delivered, or most of them have been delivered to Ukraine. The question that I'm usually getting is, that people are surprised. Why is it taking so long? We're not talking about the massive deployments. We're talking about, scattered systems that were, probably gathered from, a number of allied countries sent to Ukraine. And it's a year that we're sending just 7 systems, or, 5 or 6 of them. What is the reason behind it? Maybe you know more, or you can try to assess.
Well, there's 2 or 3 problems associated with this that all of them are solvable, but none of them are cheap or easy. First of all, of course, the Patriot itself, or any of these modern air defense, missile defense systems, are very, very complex. I mean, we're not talking about hammers or bottles of Coca-Cola here. I mean, these are very sophisticated weapons. And so the production of these things is complex, and Lockheed has about a 2 or 3 year backlog on delivering what's already been ordered by other countries, even before Russia's large-scale invasion. So it is a very, very slow process, and of course you've got one place where they manufacture most of the components in the United States, and they're in Camden, Arkansas, and if you want to increase production, you got like any other business, that company has to be confident that if they expand, build another line, hire more people, train workforce, et cetera, that they're going to be able to do it. This is not charity. They have thousands of employees in the process. And so the failure of the administration to say, we want Ukraine to win, and we're going to give them every damn thing they need, and then turn to Lockheed or Raytheon or all the other companies associated with making components and say, we'll write the check. You need to deliver 3 times more by the end of the year, et cetera. There was no demand signal like that from the U.S. administration, unfortunately, to do that. So it's a combination of demand signal, but also um, the physics involved with producing these things. We have, for a sense of scale, the U.S. has only 1 Patriot battalion in all of Europe. 1. So, and that's about how much it takes to protect Ramstein, our air base in Germany. So it's not like there's a bunch of these things just parked sitting around. They just moved Patriot from the Pacific to the Middle East in anticipation of, if something heated up with Iran against Israel, they would need more Patriots. So they're having to move these assets around because there's so few of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, talking a little bit about the numbers. So when there was a debate, how many tanks, should the country send or have already sent to Ukraine, and then the numbers from United States were like I don't remember now exactly, but I think it was something like 30 Abrams tanks. So and then when it came to HIMARS, again, it was in tenths rather than huge numbers, but then you look back, first Iraq War, you would have the biggest tank battles, in the world history, basically. Thousands of tanks would clash in the deserts of in Arabia, in Middle East. And so it was always of notion that United States possesses enormous capabilities, enormous amounts of equipment. And when it comes to Ukraine, we're seeing just a fraction of it. Is it the same de-escalation, escalation logic, so that we don't want to cross certain red line? or is it a capability problem that we currently have in this after the after the wars of the past have been ended?
You know, when I would listen to the debates about whether or not to provide Bradleys or Abrams tanks or whatever, I was astounded at the excuses that were coming out of the administration. This was still the Biden administration, and all you would hear about was like, oh, the Abrams, it burns so much fuel, it's so much maintenance required, it's all these problems, and I thought, well, if it's so bad, why the hell do we have 3,000 of them? I mean, what? I mean, I didn't understand. I couldn't understand it. And of course, these were excuses trying to justify not sending them versus what has been missing from the beginning was the declaration of a strategic objective that we want Ukraine to win, and therefore we're going to give them everything they need, everything they want without restriction, so that they can win. So, and for all your listeners, and I think if they listen to your podcast, Gabrielle, then they probably are fairly sophisticated people that think about these things. The number one job of our political leadership, our civilian leadership, is to clearly identify the objective. What is the objective? What do you want? And then turn to the military, turn to your economy, turn to your diplomats, and say, this is what we have to accomplish. It's impossible, in my view, to develop good policy if you don't have a clearly defined objective, because policy
Hmm.
is what you implement in order to accomplish that objective. It seems pretty simple, but I would challenge somebody to what was the Biden administration's strategic objective? We're with you for as long as it takes is not a strategic objective, but that was about as far as they would go. And so you could deduce from what they said and didn't say and what they delivered and didn't deliver and how that their real objective was avoiding escalation. You
Yeah.
know, and keep Ukraine somehow in the fight so that they could have this stronger negotiating position. What bullshit. That's why we are where we are now.
Yeah, I I subscribe to your opinion. Other question is, I'm sure that you followed the what is called the coalition of the willing. Where the group of countries have met and have for several during the several meetings discussed the ability to deploy European troops or allied troops, whichever way you call it, to Ukraine post ceasefire, post peace agreement. I mean, it's still very vague, but there's a military element, a clear military element outside just political debate in this. Um, okay, so first of all, do you think that it's feasible? Do you think that it's at all doable? Would is there enough? Do you see enough political will on the European continent to do that? And second question, is it possible to do without a U.S. assistance, without the U.S. enabling the operation?
So, number one, yes, of course, Europe has enough. Of course, I mean, if you add together the the combined economies, populations, militaries of um, of all of Europe, of just the EU, and then you add Canada, UK, Norway. Forget the US. It dwarfs Russia. I mean, it's so much more than what Russia has. And uh, keeping in mind that Russia can't defeat Ukraine, so I don't understand why. I can sort of understand it, but it's frustrating to see Europeans wringing their hands like, "Oh my God, we can't do this. We don't have enough." Of course you do. What's lacking is self-confidence, particularly here in Germany. Now, I do hope that once the new coalition government is in place before the middle of May, that Germany will, under Herr Merz, will lead by example or contribute or be more forward-leaning. Um, France and UK both have, I think, have been demonstrating this, but you still got
Mm.
too many people wringing their hands like, "Oh my God, we can't do this." Um, this is a problem.
But this, let's say, U.S. logistical support. or ammunition or certain types of equipment that that U.S. would have provided, to all the previous operations where Europeans would have taken part of it. Is how much truth this is in that?
The EDA told me about a year and a half ago that the European Defense Agency, that over 50% of the ammunition that is produced in Europe goes to customers in the Middle East and Africa. So, in other words, there is a lot of capacity that's out there, but it's not being directed towards support for Ukraine or filling the European armies on stocks. Now, there's nothing illegal with this. Again, these are businesses, but this is where, with political will, if a government would say to the companies in their country that are making ammunition, say, "Hey, look, we'll protect you from liability issues. We'll talk to UAE or Uganda or whoever is buying your ammunition. We're going to work with them so that you can redirect all of your ammunition to Ukraine because this is our strategic objective to win."
Hmm.
And so this is where political will comes in, is when you make decisions like that. The U.S. did that with Switzerland and Patriot. Switzerland was the next country, was already a customer, and the Swiss agreed to let Ukrainians move to the front of the line ahead of them for a particular set of Patriots. So this is where governments can, in fact, affect things. There are laws in Germany that prevent defense industry from doing certain things without a direct order from the government, right? All right, change the law. Change the law so that whether it's Rheinmetall or KNDS or whoever else is making certain things, weapons, ammunition, whatever, so that they can lean forward, anticipate requirements, expand capacity, and do things instead
Hmm.
of waiting for the Bundestag and the German federal government to say, go ahead and make 500 whatever. So yes, there is capacity that's held up for old reasons, governmental regulation, et cetera. I say you got to, take the handcuffs off and tap into the enormous industrial capacity of Europe.
Yeah, I hear you. One of the problems that I've seen was when there was a discussion regarding the conditions of sending the troops. So not just the military, but the political part. And when the representatives of the countries would say, "Look, we are, first we have to ask Putin, if Putin allows us." And then I think it was only French president who said, "Look, we're not going to ask Putin anything, right? It's our sovereign decision. It's about us." And or like, for example, when Greek prime minister said, we will stay in Ukraine up until the point where Russians return, then we're out. So it's kind of a very different strategic culture that you would expect from the countries that actually want to deter further Russian attack.
So I think that the conversation got ahead of itself in a way. People were talking about how many troops they were going to send, and we didn't, and we haven't done yet the most important thing, which is to answer the question, to do what? UK says we'll send 10,000. I would say, great. What are they supposed to do? I mean, what's their job? How can you come up with a number if you haven't decided first what is the objective? What is the task? Now, the Ukrainians, because they're actually, according to General Cavoli, and I agree with it, the Ukrainians are actually winning this war right now. You heard his testimony a couple of weeks ago in front of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. So the Ukrainians can see this, and so they're not under any real pressure to accept a bad settlement. They don't have to. And they also know that nobody on the planet trusts that Russia would live up to any agreement
Uh-huh.
unless they were forced to. And so using the structure that President Stubb of Finland used recently at the Munich Security Conference, I think you might have even been there and heard that, where he talked about 3 phases, right? I mean, these are not black and white crisp phases, but 3 sort of phases to think about what's happening to get towards conflict resolution. We're in phase one right now. This is the preparation phase. These are all these conversations happening everywhere, right? Secretary Rubio is coming to Paris today or tomorrow, I think. You've got this guy, Mr. Witkoff, is embarrassing himself in Moscow and St. Petersburg. You've got conversations in London and Paris, and that awful thing that happened in the Oval Office back on the 6th of March. All of these discussions, that's phase one, the preparation phase. There are disparate efforts trying to get to a ceasefire so that if you can get a ceasefire and a ceasefire implementation force in Ukraine, that's phase two, then you can have phase three, which are actual negotiation. So it's ridiculous to even think about negotiations now because Ukrainians know that the Russians will never live up to it. And and the idea that General Kellogg would say, well, here's the plan. We're going to divide up, let Russia have this, let Ukrainians this. And I mean, that's without Ukraine being involved in it or Europe being involved in it. And of course, Ukraine is not obligated to accept whatever the US and Russia come up with any more than Lithuania is obligated to accept it. So if you step back, preparation, ceasefire, and ceasefire implementation force, now you can have real negotiation. So what you and I are talking about now is the ceasefire and the implementation force. And the implementation force, this is not going to be guys in blue berets and flip flops. I mean, this is going to be has to be a strong, capable force that has rules of engagement that will allow it to hit back immediately each time Russia violates the ceasefire, which they will obviously attempt to do from the very first hour. So that's the hard part. If you say we need a force that is capable of deterring Russia from violating the ceasefire, so air, land, sea, drone, counter drone, long range strike, all the necessary logistics. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be stretched from Kharkiv down to Kherson. I mean, there's different ways to position that, but get the political part right first. What do you want them to do? You want them to deter Russia from ever violating the ceasefire. And when that's set, then I think the Ukrainians will feel like, okay, now we can negotiate.
Since you talk about since we talk about the ceasefire, you've mentioned previously in your other interviews that the most dangerous time for Europe would come after the ceasefire. That this is where the biggest risks for Russian escalation probably that they would come there. Could you elaborate on the scenarios that you would think are viable after the ceasefire is achieved?
So I think what I said, or certainly what I meant, the biggest risk would be if Ukraine fails, if we, the West, if Europe, the United States together, we fail to help Ukraine. And eventually, Russia is able to wear down the Ukrainians. It's not going to happen this year, but at some point, the Russians get what they want, and then they see that the West, whether it's Europe alone or Europe plus U.S. and Canada, could not or would not do what was necessary to stop them. Then they will feel, okay, the U.S. has abandoned Europe. The Europeans still can't get their shit together, and Russia would not only would they absorb tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops that would be pressed into the Russian armed forces and all the equipment and things that they would be able to hoover up, that within a couple of years they would be ready to keep going because they would see opportunity. That's what I was talking about.
But in case, okay, let's imagine a scenario where Ukrainians do agree on a ceasefire. So I mean, it's not a cold ceasefire. We would imagine something like 2014 ceasefire, where you have constant shootings, back and forth. The people would die, and at least that was the reality on Ukrainian side. for Russians, what do you think they would do? Because there are people who would say that, okay, maybe Russians would demobilize. For them it's very expensive to keep, that big of an army. But then again, others would say, maybe it's not wise for them to demobilize and return people from the battlefield back home somewhere in the far east of Russia. What do you think Russians would do?
Well, that's a good question. I think the way that their economy is going right now, they would have a very difficult time kind of transitioning back to a traditional peacetime sort of economy. So in a way, the Russian government almost has to keep this going um, longer than maybe they might even they might want to. So that also adds to the potential risk if they are not defeated. I mean, if they are not defeated, then I think there's a risk that they will make a terrible calculation that Europe is still not prepared, still not willing to do what's necessary to defend itself, and the U.S. has moved on or turned its back. So that's, to me, that's the dangerous part. That's why actually winning, helping Ukraine defeat Russia, the old-fashioned on the battlefield, defeat them, um, and also using, as you know, all the economic tools that we have to crush their oil and gas industry to stop them from being able to sell to China and India. Um, that's the only way that we make sure that there's not a next phase of this war. And I would also say, um, if you defeat Russia, it isolates Iran. Iran has no friends on the planet. So there's a strategic benefit of defeating Russia, which is the isolation of the regime in Iran. And then the Chinese are looking at all this and they're like, wow, okay. I mean, the West really is serious about sovereignty, freedom of navigation, international law. By the way, in 1941, the U.S. Army was number 17 in the world, just below Bulgaria. So that's where we were. So Churchill comes to Washington, D.C. in December of 41, stays over for Christmas, and then in January 1942, so the U.S. Navy in Pearl Harbor is underwater or on fire. I mean, we were desperate. Churchill and Roosevelt meet, and they realize that they had to defeat Germany first. They had to defeat Nazi Germany first, and then they could defeat the Empire of Japan. Otherwise, we might lose Great Britain to the war effort, and it would be very, very difficult going forward. So these two old guys made the strategic decision: Germany first, defeat Nazi Germany first. And so thinking about where the war was in early 1942, Roosevelt is still able to turn to the American people and explain what was at stake, why we had to do this. And he got the Congress behind it, changed the laws necessary. He tells Ford Motor Company, you're not going to nobody's going to be buying cars for the next few years. You're going to make Army trucks. And Westinghouse, nobody's going to buy a refrigerator for the next couple of years. You're going to make machine guns. And so they got onto this war footing. And then 1 year later, at the Casablanca conference in January of 43, these two old guys meet again and they agree on the strategic objective, which was unconditional surrender. Not get to a better negotiating position with Hitler or Emperor Hirohito, unconditional surrender. We're going to fucking crush them. And so now you've got strategic priority, Germany first, strategic objective, unconditional surrender. And the U.S. Army by the end of the war had 12 million people in it. In the space of about 3.5
Yeah.
years. Okay. That transition, 3.5 years. So when our political leaders speak to the population as if they are adults and talk about what's at stake, what the risks are, what the cost is going to be, and what we're going to have to do it, I think actually in most democratic societies, people will go along with it if they believe what they're being told and can see that there's an end to it. That's that's how you mobilize populations and economies. That's what Churchill and Roosevelt did so well.
Ben, that's an excellent example. I'm usually asking a question, like a rhetoric question. What would be the Pearl Harbor moment today for the West to really wake up and, and start carrying the weight that it should be carrying?
Well, unfortunately, most of our countries only really respond after a disaster like we did after 9/11. Then we woke up, or after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I remember talking to the Dutch army chief a few years ago after the Malaysian airliner was shot down and over 100 Dutch civilian citizens were killed on that shoot down. So that's what all of a sudden becomes serious. And I'm afraid the Pearl Harbor moment is probably going to be something that happens where Russia attacks a NATO country. It won't be like in the Cold War where we knew that the Soviet Union was planning all the way across Europe to conquer most of Europe. Now it's just to break NATO. And if they can attack a NATO country and the rest of the alliance does not respond, then they will have accomplished what it is they're trying to do.
I would like to ask a question that is, on many of the people that I talk to, minds right now is about the possible repositioning of the U.S. in Europe. There are a couple of scenarios mentioned publicly. I mean, they are all mostly from analysts. What do you think might have happened? What do we need to be prepared for?
Hmm.
In most likely case, from your perspective, how could it look like?
Okay. So, the Obama administration wanted to shift to the Indo-Pacific region as a priority, but they stopped because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Um, the Trump administration has made it clear that their priority is also the Indo-Pacific region. So, even if the Trump administration was a normal sort of administration, a traditional, let's say, that's going to happen. Uh, and the administration clearly believes, and I don't disagree with this, that Europe is capable of defending itself with some U.S. participation because we do have interests here. U.S. troops are not in Lithuania guarding Lithuanians. They're there as part of protecting our strategic interests, just like all the thousands of Americans in Germany and Italy and Turkey and so on. So this is going to happen. There is going to be this strategic shift, no doubt. Now, what does that mean? It's a different theater. So it's a theater that's predominantly maritime and air. So you don't need as large a land force. And my expectation is that the regular army, what we call big army, the 450,000 soldiers that make up the regular army, not National Guard, not reserve, is going to get about a 20% cut. I mean, 20 to 25%. So you're talking about over 100,000 troops. That's a lot. That's going to happen, I think, over the next 2 or 3 years. Now, we've gone through this before. The Army is always the bill payer because if you want a lot of money fast, you do it by cutting manpower. That's how you can get hundreds of billions of dollars is by getting rid of troops. So I anticipate that we're going to go through another one of these kind of drawdowns. That's one part of that. And so, of course, U.S. Army Europe, which only has about 30,000 assigned permanent live in Europe, um, obviously that will be a part of that cut too. The Congress would always want to protect troops at home in their state more than somebody that's living in Stuttgart or Wiesbaden or Kaiserslautern. So that's going to be part of this process. The second part of the process is if you're trying to save money for something else, reprioritize money, the most vulnerable are those rotational forces. Every tank, every Bradley that's in Europe now is part of a rotational force because back before 2014, the last tanks went home. So after the Warsaw Summit in 2016, the Obama administration made the decision to bring back armor to Europe. And so I think we have like 5 brigades now of uh, armored brigade combat teams that are in Poland, Lithuania, Romania, Germany, and in different places That's all paid for uh, with a supplemental fund called the European Defense Initiative that the Congress started back in 2016. That's above regular budget. So that's the easiest to cut from a budgeting standpoint is stop spending supplemental money that's above the budget. So having said that, every administration will go through what we call a global force posture review, where you look at the world, you match your strategic priorities, your resources, where can you accept risk? And I think that's what we're seeing happening now is that the administration, which still has not filled all their key positions. I mean, Bridge Colby is the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He was just confirmed last week. So they still are getting the team together. But I know down the road from where I live in Frankfurt, down in Wiesbaden at the headquarters of U.S. Army Europe, they're having to go through this process to figure out who do we absolutely have to have, what risk will we have if we have to give up a certain capability. So um, I think we're going to see this happening over the next 1, 2, 3 years, a reduction in the rotational force and a reduction in the assigned force of what is in Europe. I just don't know how fast or exactly how much.
What a country like Lithuania should do to prepare.
Well, of course, what Lithuania has been doing is your own modernization efforts, building the national division that you're doing, and working hard with the German Enhanced Forward Presence Brigade that's being established there. All of this is important to making it for Lithuania, making itself indigestible. I mean, to be so strong, so capable that the Russians would not want to pay the price they would have to pay if they decided to attack into Lithuania. But of course, Lithuania is not an island. It has an ally to the north and an ally to the south. And so making sure that Polish and Lithuanian forces are integrated. Same with Latvian and Lithuanian
Latvian.
forces. That's an important part of this, and I think the most likely place where if Russia was going to make the terrible decision to attack, would probably be north north of Lithuania towards Daugavpils, and that I mean that's the most feasible place. I think Lithuanians have to assume that it might be 2 weeks in a worst case scenario. If it was a cold start and we got surprised, it might be 2 weeks before additional forces came from somewhere else outside of Lithuania. So what's there is there, but it might be, excuse me, it might be 2 weeks in a worst case.
To hold on.
Yeah. And so what you're doing now, landmines, barriers, obstacle plans, and even the idea of having Leopard tanks makes a lot of sense because you don't want the Russians to be able to get in and grab a foothold somehow. You'd have to be able to immediately eject that. And so those are the capabilities I think that are required. And I know you have done a lot of work to increase the ability to rapidly field reservists and territorial forces, the way the Finns do it, for example. That's an important part of this. So a resilient society is a part of it.
Well, thank you, Ben. And the last question is: so most of my readers and viewers ask a question. So, what do we need to be advocating for right now? Do we need to be asking for Taurus missiles to Ukraine? Do we need to be suggesting that the Kerch bridge could be struck? Like, what is the objective for the followers, for the viewers? What is our aim now? Where should we put our efforts in?
Well, certainly in Ukraine, I think General Budanov is going to take down that big bridge when he's ready. I mean, I'm sure that he's got a dry erase board in his office, and they know how and when and where they're going to do that. That'll be good because really Crimea for me has always been the most strategically important place. That's the only reason the Russians want it is because of how important Crimea is. So being able to deny that to the Russians would be very important. And I don't think a couple of Taurus missiles is what it's going to take to destroy that bridge. That is a massive bridge, and it's going to take more than just that. I think advocating for industry growth inside of Ukraine is an important thing to do, to invest there. But I would also say that what's happening in the Baltic Sea is a part of this. That to see, what Estonia just did to seize this oil tanker. I'm sure there was a lot of tough, hard thinking and arguments about whether or not to do it because worried about repercussions. But it's exactly the right thing to do. That's the only way you stop Russia's aggressive activities that they're doing there, the sabotage, destruction, threats, violations, ignoring international law. And I hope that other countries around the Baltic Sea, including Germany and Poland, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, will also do that. Gabriel, if you'll allow me to say in the last 2 minutes here before we end, thank you to the people of Lithuania for what you did for our soldiers, the huge effort that the government put into, and your soldiers and people trying to find these 4 young men that drowned. Nothing will ever bring them back. But the way from your president on down, the way everybody put their arms around the U.S. Army there in Lithuania, thank you for that.
Well, it's our way to do that, at least, to thank them for their service and what they did and what the US is doing for our security. It has always been paramount, and we'll do our part. Well, thank you so much, dear Ben. Thank you for joining me, and it has been a very interesting conversation, and thank you so much for finding time to do that.
Well, I'm grateful for the privilege and the opportunity you gave me, and
thank you so much. Take care.